Welcome to Prout Study Circle Program. This video is intended for Prout Study in the Philippines. Today's topic in Session 4 is about the social cycle, understanding history and the dynamics of collective psychology. Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, the author of the concept of the social cycle, is one of the Prout, progressive utilization theory, key components, describing the cyclical nature of social and economic development. Sarkar places the rise, manifestative pause, fall, systolic pause, and rise, manifestative pause, of social and economic development in the same language that explains aspects of history. According to Sarkar, social and economic development follow a dialectical path: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Sarkar's social cycle evolved his conception of class theory by analyzing human history and developing models of the different collective psychologies that have dominated society. In Prout, class is synonymous with collective psychology and is a group of people having similar forms of psychosocial expression. Collective psychology has been defined as the average psychic momentum derived from the unit psychic momenta whose manifestations are the events on the pages of history. Human history is the history of collective psychology, and the collective psychologies that dominate society in different historical epochs are the psychologies of different ruling classes. Sarkar's social cycle theory of history constructs four classes: workers, warriors, intellectuals, and accumulators of capital. Each class can be perceived not merely as a power configuration, but as a way of knowing the world, as a paradigm, episteme, or deep structure. In Sarkar's language, this is collective psychology or Varna, here, dramatically reinterpreting caste. At the individual level, there is Varna mobility, one can change the influence of history and social environment. At the macro level, each Varna comes into power bringing in positive necessary changes, but over time exploits and then dialectically creates the conditions for the next Varna. This cycle continues through history and for Sarkar is indeed an iron law of history, true irrespective of space/time and observer conditions. It is a law because it has developed historically through evolution and because the cycle represents a universal social structure. For Sarkar, there have been four historical eras where humans have dealt with their physical and social environment. 1. Shudra era, characterized by collective ownership, focus on basic needs, and simple living. 2. Kshatriya era, emphasis shifts to power, expansion, and centralized governance. 3. Vipra era, knowledge and intellectual pursuits become paramount, leading to advancements in science and art. 4. Vaishya era, materialism and wealth acquisition dominate, often leading to economic disparity in societal decay. It should be emphasized that the concept of the social cycle is not derivable solely from an examination of human history, although human history appears to conform closely to the pattern of social evolution described in the social cycle. Rather, the theory of the social cycle, like Einstein's theory of relativity, was a product of deep intuition. The usefulness of the theory of the social cycle will depend on its correctness, its generality, and its applicability of society's current situation. Let us briefly illustrate the social cycle by looking at how it manifests itself historically in the Philippine setting. The earliest known hominin remains in the Philippines is the fossil discovered in 2007 is the Calao man in Cagayan. The 67,000-year-old find predates the 47,000-year-old Taban man, which was until then the earliest known set of human remains in the archipelago. Physical anthropologists who have examined the Taban man's skullcap have agreed that it belonged to a modern man, Homo sapiens, as distinguished from the mid-Pleistocene Homo erectus species. This indicates that Taban man was pre-Mongoloid, Mongoloid being the term anthropologists apply to the racial stock which entered Southeast Asia during the Holocene and absorbed earlier peoples to produce the modern Malay, Indonesian, Filipino, and Pacific peoples. It was initially thought to be possibly one of the oldest Homo sapiens remains in the Asia-Pacific. Early human inhabitants in prehistoric Philippines did not have a well-knit social structures. Their mentalities were dominated by fear, superstition, and narrow individualism and pleasure-seeking. There was little concern for parents, children, or mate, except that arising out of self-interest. This Shudran era occurred at the dawn of human history and lasted until the late prehistoric times, until the rise of leaders with a strong warrior mentality. The known recorded history of the Philippines between 900 AD and 1565 AD begins with the creation of the Laguna copperplate inscription in 900 AD and ends with the beginning of Spanish colonization in 1565 AD. The inscription records its creation date in the year 822 of the Hindu Saka calendar, corresponding to 900 AD in the Gregorian calendar. Therefore, the recovery of this document marks the end of the prehistory of the Philippines at 900 AD. During this historical period, the Philippine archipelago was home to numerous kingdoms known as the Datus, Rajas, and Sultanates. It was a part of the theorized Indosphere, also known as the Indian cultural sphere, and Sinosphere, also known as the Chinese cultural sphere. The Laguna copperplate inscription is the earliest record of a Philippine language and the presence of writing in the islands. The document measures around 20 centimeters by 30 centimeters and is inscribed with 10 writing lines on one side. The text of the Laguna copperplate inscription was mostly written in Old Malay with influences of Sanskrit, Old Javanese, and Old Tagalog using the Kawi script. Dutch anthropologist Antoon Postma deciphered the text. The date of the inscription is in the year of Saka 822, the month of Vaisakha, corresponding to April-May in 900 AD. There are several misconceptions about pre-colonial Philippine history that have been debunked by historians and researchers. Some of these include the idea that the Philippines was not a unified entity before the arrival of the Spanish, when in fact, there were various forms of political organization and cultural exchange among different indigenous groups. Another misconception is the belief that the Philippines was entirely primitive and uncivilized before colonization, whereas in reality, there were sophisticated social structures, trade networks, and artistic and technological achievements in pre-colonial times. Additionally, there is a misconception that the arrival of the Spanish brought civilization to the Philippines, ignoring the rich cultural heritage and advancements of indigenous communities prior to colonization. These misconceptions are being addressed through ongoing research and efforts to promote a more accurate understanding of pre-colonial Philippine history. For over 400 years, the Philippines, like other peripheral regions, has suffered under colonialism, under military, ideological, and economic control from external empires and nation-states. First, came the Spanish ships, and through their superior firepower, they quickly defeated the Datus, the pre-colonial chieftains. Thus, from the year of the warriors, the Philippines moved to the era of the priest. The Christian cross became not the symbol of sacrifice but the symbol of conquest. The priests, through a variety of incentives, the promise of heaven, and in this world, the promise of jobs and other rewards, slowly converted the Filipinos to Christianity. Although certainly there may have been progressive elements in this conversion, the purpose of this was to stop the inroads made by Islamic traders and develop an ideology supportive of Spain and capitalist development. As the warrior era deteriorated, these intellectuals gradually moved into positions of more and more power. The Datus gradually became the servants of these intellectuals. The Datus had to swear to uphold the laws, religions, and social codes introduced by the intellectuals to support their positions of power and to keep the power of the Datus in check. So the Vipran era became established. Society was then dominated by intellectuals instead of warriors. These intellectuals or Vipras served as political ministers, military strategists, inventors of new weapons, and priests and teachers. The intellectuals maintained power by keeping people's minds ensnared in religious and social dogmas. Even relatively intelligent persons found it convenient to accept these dogmas for reasons of their self-interest. But when tough times arise, intellectuals fail to cope, and have to sell themselves to anyone with means and resources. Since Vaishyas or capitalists have the wealth that the intellectuals require, the capitalists start commanding the intellectuals, who are forced to obey. The intellectuals then go to work inflating the wealth of the capitalists by providing them with strategies for tax evasion, bribery, food and medicine adulteration, and many other means. Gradually, in the service of capitalists, the intellectuals lose their intellectual originality and become hacks and drudges in the employ of the capitalists. Then the capitalists can move into greater positions of social power, finally establishing themselves as the dominant social class. Soon the reins of government are in the control of these capitalists. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States. The interim U.S. military government of the Philippine Islands experienced a period of great political turbulence, characterized by the Philippine-American War. Beginning in 1906, the military government was replaced by a civilian government, the Insular Government of the Philippine Islands, with William Howard Taft serving as its first Governor-General. A series of insurgent governments that lacked significant international and diplomatic recognition also existed between 1898 and 1904. Following the passage of the Philippine Independence Act in 1934, a Philippine presidential election was held in 1935. Manuel L. Quezon was elected and inaugurated as the second president of the Philippines on November 15, 1935. The insular government was dissolved and the Commonwealth of the Philippines, intended to be a transitional government in preparation for the country's full achievement of independence in 1946, was brought into existence. After the World War II Japanese invasion in 1941 and subsequent occupation of the Philippines, the United States retained their economic rights in exchange for development funds to rebuild the Philippine economy as raw material supplier while maintaining its landlord-oriented colonial economic structure. Of course, during this phase of Philippine history, there were many marked nationalistic movements that have attempted to construct a Philippines for the Filipinos. But each movements have been defeated by military means or through co-optation by the ruling elite, allowing the Philippines to further integrate into world economy. The subsequent Vysya era of the Philippines' history was dominated by the British and American capitalists in late 18th century during the American colonial period. The American capitalists soon realized that they could maintain control more easily under democratic framework than under a datu system. The Philippines is a classic example of pseudo-cultural exploitation by capitalists. After the American liberated the Filipinos from Spanish colonization in 1898, they embarked on intensive 10-year pacification campaign of pseudo-cultural propagation. The Americans were presented as benevolent altruists who has accepted the burden of educating their little brown brothers who were not ready for self-government. The nationwide school system organized by the Americans established English as the language of instruction, distorted the history of American occupation, taught American rather than Filipino history, and altogether glorified the American way of life. The myth was spread that American investments were indispensable for economic progress, and free enterprise the only framework for democracy.